Hi world! Patricia, O'Connor, and Frida, Reba, Darcy is in the house, and it is the bonsai balcony today. I've got framed up a few little pine trees, and that is going to be, as I've been doing for a little while, that's going to be our topic today. I mean, we've been mixing it up some. We did a Trident Maple show a couple of days ago, but I've been talking about ponderosas and black pines a good bit lately. 'Tis the season for that, would be why. These are all Shohin pine trees, and all of them but one, save one, all of them save one are ponderosas. 1, 2, 3, 4 ponderosas. And then this guy is a little Japanese black pine that was in the same general area when I was collecting these trees today. So I just grabbed it up too. And I grabbed it up too, I'm trying to get my sweater up from under my fat butt. And I grabbed it up too because it still has the candles on it, and because it was hanging out with the ponderosas. I missed it a day or two ago when I did a few more of its trees. So I just thought I'd confuse the issue and throw it in the mix with what we're talking about. But except for that, these guys are all ponderosas. We ordered these on mail order. They arrived beautiful, vigorous, from I think either Washington or Oregon, someplace north of us, not too far because I'm in the Bay Area of San Francisco, Oakland Bay Area, Alameda technically. And they arrived really quick, really healthy. They were plugs, which is to say that they were not potted. And we potted these guys up, threw some wire to them, and started folding them up the way we had done the black pines that we had before them. And they're a hoot. But ponderosas are a different species of pine, of course, than Japanese black pines. And they differ in a lot of ways. They're also compatible in some cool ways. But right now, it's June 12th. So we're well into candle cutting season for our Japanese black pine. That also varies depending on where you are. Some places will go through this earlier, some places will go through this later. Also, I've never been 100% sure that my candle cutting season when it comes to Japanese black pines or multi-flush pines isn't at least partially responsible to my lights. That might make a little variation from my candle cutting season a few weeks different than somebody with a garden next door to me who had their trees in their backyard. I've never really gotten a good answer to that because I don't compare myself to other people's gardens in person in real time around this time of year to get that. But anyway, it's candle cutting season if you have multi-flush black pines right now. And what that means is they are in a bonsai pot and their roots are being restricted, that you go through and we remove the candles, and then we let those come through. And that's how we pretty much do multi-flush pines. And I just kind of went through that really quick just to explain what I'm about to do here to anybody who hadn't seen the last 4 or 5 videos where I've done these. Boom. That was that year's candle. It grew out that much. It doesn't even look like a candle at this point, but it is. I'm still throwing these scissors right in there in this little not dead space, but it's a little, what was the green space in between last year's growth and the candle that just came out. In here, at the end of candle cutting season, or towards the end of it, not really the end of it, but towards late in candle cutting season, I'll say that. For my balcony, they get this long, this big, this developed. It's even slightly difficult on some of them because the needles have extended out enough and laid out enough that it's kind of on some of these it's a little trickier to find that zone where that candle actually started. Like this one, it's almost, that little space is almost not visible. Good pull. All right. So with that, I caught up on this guy. Now, by having removed this year's growth, in about 3 weeks, this little black pine will have responded by putting out a cluster of buds at the cut site. Also, there's no substrate. I mean, no substrate. It's full of substrate. There's no bio gold on here. I pulled up the fertilizer about 25, 30 days ago, and the tree has been living off of the leftover fertilizer in its system and growing those candles that we just cut off of that nutrition. So what it will now do is grow a cluster, meaning a bunch, probably more than 4, at each one of those sites that I just cut. And what those clusters will do is they will require more energy still that the tree has to shell out for. And now it's looking at how much resources it had for needle growth. It's looking at how many bud sites it just put out. And when all of those buds come out, they will come out with shorter needles. Later on this fall, when all of those bud sites and all of those needles have extended to their full length, and we know what that is by their color, by their strength, and by a little bit of pull, and they pull back, that means they're locked in. At that point, we go to every cluster and we select it down to 2, and we cut away all the rest of them. And those 2 will have shorter needles because all of that extra energy would have been allocated to all of those other buds that we've just cut off during the year. And that's how you get short needles on a multi-flush pine. That's also the time to go back to feeding because they've been hungry for a minute. And now that the needles are the length they're going to be for the year, you can resume feeding and start putting back all of that stuff back into it. Let it start making that for root growth and all the other stuff. Pines are evergreens. Even if it slows down in the winter, it doesn't stop. Some people do stop fertilizing their trees. I don't. I go year round because here in Alameda, it's warmer than that. We're still kind of active, I think, in the winter. That's also probably not such a great thing for the ponderosas. But that's what the rest of these trees here, and that's actually primarily what our show's about today are these ponderosas. The action part of our show, though, pretty much concluded with that Japanese black pine. Because with these guys, I have beautiful, beautiful little ponderosas. The trunks that they make and the things that they do, some of which is very familiar to me because of the work that we've done before with our black pines. For instance, every one of these that I put copper wire to and folded up tight, the tree responded in the same way that we would already know if you watch the stuff we did with the Japanese black pines. The tree responds to being coiled up tightly by swelling up fatter in its wire and pushing out back buds everywhere. It's as if you took a water hose that was full of water, clamped up both ends, and started turning it into a pretzel in such a way that the water wanted to squeeze out in all these places. That's what the trees seem to do with back buds all over. That's beneficial. Ponderosas, pines, ponderosa pines come from the high elevation, single flush. Their foliage has a very, very coarse vascular system. They also, like a coarse vascular system, it's rough, It's not quite as waxy as the Japanese black pine, which has a very fine vascular system. If you were to magnify the needles of the Japanese black pine, you'd see all of these holes in it like cheese. And those holes in the needles, microscopic of course, would have a water droplet that had been pushed up by the liquids in the by the motion of the tree, forcing up all of the nutrients and all the other stuff that runs through it. And it would push these water molecules at those opening holes where air mixes with them and evaporates them, and then they are replaced by another microscopic droplets of water. And in that way, a Japanese black pine will move quite a bit of water quite rapidly. On a hot day, you might water something that has a small pot more than once a day, and that's how it moves water. Ponderosas, not so. Their growing season, way shorter, way more intense. Their temperatures, higher and way lower. By this time of, not by this time of year, but by August sometimes, they're already being snowed on. Their summer at high elevations might only be 4 months. And in that 4 months, a lot of extremes happen. What they've adapted to do is send out roots wherever they can and try to find resources there. And then sometimes they'll shut these roots off, not kill them, just kind of put them in dormancy. Make a taproot deeper if it needs to, find some moisture there. If things start happening where they're getting in a drought, all those roots on top of the soil, they'll shut them off, and then they'll start asking to see if this guy over here that had been vacant for a minute has it accumulated anything. And then they'll do that to the taproot. The difference being the surface roots will have shut themselves off and not died, but held whatever it was they had and kind of stay in limbo. And the needles can do that too. They can lock onto their moisture so that they don't actually give it back up to the soil that's drying out around them, or they can hold on to it long enough to survive until they find water again. A ponderosa will completely expend everything it had out of this certain little root that found its way to grow in the crack of a rock, only to decide once that one's gone that it'll send another one off over here, or maybe in a couple of years when that root's been dead long enough, it'll send another spike out there because that was a good resource once. It may be again someday. And they just kind of always have to work these angles to try to find ways to survive. And that's the long and short of the existence of ponderosas. They're known to be drier climate. You're not supposed to water these as much as you would your Japanese black pines. If you're the kind of person whose Japanese black pines kind of tends to get yellow or something because you're a little too eager with the water, you're really going to have to watch that more with the ponderosas. Their vascular system moves really, really slowly. Also, they're a single flush species. So, to look at these trees now, some things that we can tell about them are that they lend themselves well to being bent and folded. And on this one that we did maybe 6-7 months ago, it responded just like I was saying earlier. It's pushing out back buds everywhere. This was our original plug, and it's going to yield for us all kinds of beautiful exposed roots. It already is. I'm just looking forward to those becoming more and more woody and becoming more and more features of this tree. Also because it's a ponderosa, because it doesn't like being overwatered, but then it also doesn't like its roots sitting in damp soil. So we tend to make its soil a little rockier, its particles a little bigger, to allow for a little bit more oxygen in between the spaces, so that air exchange between water and gas happens more quickly and more readily without the plant having to do it itself. So that's what's going on there. But whereas it was at some stage, no matter where you live in the United States or Japan or whatever, it's probably cattle cutting season or the end of cattle cutting season or midway through, depending on the size of your trees and a little bit more about your climate variation. Whereas that's the way you do multi-flush. These guys are single flush. Ponderosa puts out these needles and just kind of hangs on to them. And also they tend to not stop growing. The buds that this guy puts out in 3 weeks, this Japanese black pine puts out in 3 weeks, they'll stop growing this fall. We will have done our job towards restricting the needles, and incidentally, this will be the first year for that, and we will hope that the needles will be shorter. What the object is to get shorter needles than this. Compared to this, these are short needles, but it's a different species. These make long needles. These are long needle, single flush pines. How do we get the needles shorter on those? Can we get the needles shorter on those? And when I'm saying get the needles shorter, why do we want to? This needle comes out from the base. It's probably been here since I got it. It's been growing the whole time. So let's say it's the second or third year needle. It's as long as the tree. Excuse me. In proportion, if this were a grown ponderosa, ponderosas can grow 100 feet. Japanese black pine, you get a super healthy one, 50, maybe 80. But these guys, they take their name from their stature. They're big, heavy, tall pieces of lumber. Ponderosa. So this needle proportionate for this to be a miniature representation of a tree, that would be a 100-foot long needle, 50, 75-foot long needle. I mean, in proportion wise. So we would want shorter needles. And if I look on the tree, I can find some shorter needles on here, some younger, shorter needles on here. Excuse me. But I've also had ponderosas that had much shorter needles than this guy. Maybe this long on a tree that was this tall, that was a part of our collection for several years, called Hoss. We lost Hoss last year. You can still find Hoss in the back videos about our ponderosas. It was a 20-plus-year-old ponderosa collected in Deadwood, South Dakota, like 2 more I have behind me. I think the mistake. I think I made a mistake on. I know I made a mistake on Hoss, and I think that cost us that tree. I think otherwise it wasn't showing signs of having a lot of problems until I did something that's considered not good, and I didn't know it. And I found out about that shortly afterwards, and went, well, we'll just have to wait and see. And we waited and we saw. So, the point in bringing up Hoss is there is still a video record of that tree, as is with all of my trees, wins and losses. And you can see that Hoss, as a Shohin, had quite small needles. They were about that big. And whereas that's way, way shorter than anything on this still seedling, was that proportionately correct? If we were to think of Hoss as a giant tree with needles that were, that long, be the correct size for a tree? No, they were way longer than a living tree's needles would have, proportionate to that size. If that were a towering tree, for instance, instead of being 5 inches tall, if it were 85, 75, 80, 100 feet, those needles proportionately would have been way longer than even Siamese cat-like. So they needed to be shorter still, but that's a pretty good example of a tree that you can have that's pretty close. And I don't really know that anybody had deliberately tried to shorten the needles on that tree prior to that. some of the things that I had done in design would have been counterproductive. They wouldn't have risked its health, but they would have caused it to flush out more needles, and they would have continued to make long needles. There is a practice for making needles short on ponderosas. There's also there's more than one way. Just as we do candle cutting and pruning and needle selection, and then later in fall bud selection on our Japanese black pine, there is a procedure vastly different than that we do for our ponderosas. A couple of things. When it comes to the ponderosa, you hear that they're drought resilient and that they can survive in very harsh conditions. That's the reason they were found in this place where other species of trees weren't found there. It's not necessarily saying they love to be starved of water and that they absolutely love high wind and cruddy conditions. No, they can just tolerate them more than the other species of trees that lives in that environment. So whenever it comes to being top dog on that south-facing cliff, they get to be that because the other species of high elevation can't live there. They're going to be a couple of 100 feet back off the face of that cliff or something. And it's what they can tolerate versus what they would like. What they would like is to be watered more than they got in the wild and fed, because those are two things that they never ever got. So if you collect a ponderosa, you might come across a wild ponderosa that's had Yamadori that's had quite a few years put in, and maybe the needles are small. The needles are small because it's got 1 foot in the grave and has since it sprouted from the ground, and all of that hardship has led to smaller needles and a very sparse tree. So you come up and you go, wow, the ponderosa pine with small needles. What a ready-made bonsai. And you collect that tree, you put it in a container, you bring it home, and then all of a sudden it starts getting watered and fed and maintained, and you're bringing the vigor and the health back in the tree, and the following spring comes around and it puts out a whole bunch of flushes of really, really, really long needles. And you're like, holy smoke, what have I done? I thought I had found some kind of cross species ponderosa or something that just had genetically short needles, and now this thing's coming out like Siamese cat whiskers. Well, it's because you fed it and it's regaining its health. And you should keep doing that, not stop. So if you keep doing that, the needles will grow out and they'll grow long. Continue to feed the tree. Continue to water the tree regularly. Those longer needles will cause more photosynthesis. That more photosynthesis will be more starches and sugars, more energy, more food, more everything. That turns into more roots. More roots in a bonsai pot means more confined roots. But then it will push out in the following spring even more buds, because it got all of that energy allocation off of those new roots and all of that photosynthesis that it got the year before when it stopped starving to death off of the side of whatever. So you continue this, and on the 3rd year, stop feeding it. You pull up the substrate and you stop feeding it. In the following spring, when the new growth pushes out, it puts out new buds just like it's been doing, only because of the buds that it put out the year before and the length they've been allowed to grow out, and the buds that it put out the year before of your 2-year needles and the length that they've been allowed to grow out, those are all really, really long, really, really healthy, and your tree is starting to maybe look a little overgrown. But we're rolling into that 3rd year. That next flush of pine needles is going to have a hard time maintaining the length of those ones the year before, of last year and the year before. Those were the salad years. Those were the good years when an abundance of everything and there was room to put out more stuff. Now we're running out of room for roots. We've got still a pretty good hold on the energy enough to put out another good flush of buds, but they're not going to be, the needles are not going to be as long, they're going to be shorter. At this point, we let those guys go out and do their thing, and when they've grown, we pretty much will see from there on a shorter needle length from those. That's the time we go in with our scissors and we start pruning back some of that extra length, a lot of that extra needles and stuff. Until that point, we're not removing any candles. We're not removing any candles. It'll spend the next 2 years letting this guy and this guy, these two candles that are getting along, it's just gonna get taller. It'll be almost like on the Japanese black pines when we let a sacrifice branch grow out really tall and then cut it 3 or 4 years down the line because it made our trunk fat. That will happen. But we're a couple of years away from cutting these guys back down to Shohin level again so that we can get those needles shorter. When we've done everything we can do to get these needles short, will they be nice looking bonsai trees? Yes, they will be nice looking bonsai trees before then. Will they be proportionately accurate for a representation in miniature of a large tree? When done its best, it's doubtful. It's doubtful. You can have a beautiful Ponderosa Shohin, but would it win the Kokofu with its needle length? No. It would probably kind of fall into this whimsical, really good looking, but not quite what you could tick the box as a perfectly finished tree. I still think when it comes down to a tree that's supposed to be Shohin, that at some stage or another our shortest needle growth would still be too big for a tree that's this big. At the end of the day, those two lengths don't quite jive. Satisfying to look at? Yes. In fact, on my end, I spend so much time looking at smaller potted trees, I've kind of lost my sense of just how tiny they would need to be on some of my Japanese black pines. I go, oh, that's going to look so much better next year, and it's probably still going to be quite a bit longer than you know. I'm just kind of, that end of my judgment is a little jaded because I have so many trees in regular bonsai pots. But Shohin pines should have very, very tiny needles. Mame, ridiculously so, right? Mine look whimsical and cute more than dynamic and perfect. And I recognize that, but we're just starting with them, and I've already robbed too much energy for other immature reasons like frequent repottings and stuff, that I'm just kind of starting to get my feel for that. But that's basically how that works. So these trees have been wired and their roots are in a confined space. They will continue to be fed and they will get more water than they would get in the wild. Not enough to overwater them, and they will go through their water a little bit faster. And they're going to respond to that by doing what they're already doing, putting out a whole bunch more back buds. And for the next 2 years, we'll allow all these candles, all this thing to overgrow. 1 year, 2 years, and that'll be going on the 3rd year. Then I'll lift up all this biogold and we start running off the coffers. At the end of the summer, that's when we'll go through and we will have seen that year's candles, that year's buds, that year's new growth should be shorter. And at that point, we will go through and start cutting back a lot of our under stuff. You know, maybe between then we may have removed a little bit of the undergrowth, but we haven't been needle cutting. We haven't even been cleaning them up. We've been allowing the more needles it makes, the better. Even if that goes against styling design necessarily, the more needles it makes, the better. That's the idea of it, to make all those needles so that they can start using up all of that energy so that it's flourishing, but at the same time it's got this conveyor belt going, and it figures out it's got to start streamlining this stuff down, or it's going to have an issue. And so when it streams stuff down, that plays right into our hands, and we can expect shorter needles for the next several years. So you then clean up all your overgrowth, and you clean up all the some of the back buds that you don't want, and you do your branch selection then, and you go back, and that would be the time to show that tree. That would be the time to go ta-da with that tree, and you can expect that for a couple of years, and after that you start over again. And that's the process for multi-flush pines. Specifically, I don't really know how it varies for white pines. I don't have any white pines. But that is how you would specifically do, I think. Well, that's how you would do ponderosas. I don't want to get started into other species of pines that I don't have. I'm tempted to say loblollies and Scots and stuff, but I don't. Scots already have short needles, so I don't really know why you would do that. The other way, another thing you could do to make needles shorter on these, and it'll probably happen to these trees at some stage of the game, we can graft them. I'd already alluded to the part where I said that ponderosas have a very coarse vascular system. Japanese black pine is a very fine vascular system. You can graft any pine to any pine. A lot of the times it works. Great one way, horrible the other. In other words, you can graft Japanese black pine onto a ponderosa. It probably wouldn't be a good idea to graft a ponderosa onto a Japanese black pine. The fine vascular system of the Japanese black pine would find existing on a ponderosa to be luxurious. It would have the water system in this tree is capable of so much more than it actually delivers. Because remember, I was saying how these needles can lock off and hold their water. That hasn't had an effect on the tree that it makes tiny little passages that barely move water. This guy's a fire hydrant. That's the analogy. This guy is a fire hydrant. And if you put a needle on here or a bud on here that can move water, the fire hydrant's going, yeah, we got you. Boom, pressure up, and it will thrive. The opposite of that would not work. A coarse vascular system onto a fine vascular system tree would probably struggle. So if I were to graft Japanese black pine buds to these ponderosas, and by graft, I mean I would take a grafting knife and I would go up to a branch that doesn't have bark on it, close back to the main trunk, because you don't want to do this out on the end of a branch. You want to do this close back to the main. There's branches out here, there's limbs out here, there's a lot of needles out here. That means there's a lot of stuff inside the tree going back and forth closer to the trunk. It's all going either to those branches and twigs or it's coming back from it. So if you get a crossroad where there's a lot of activity, that's a good place for a graft. Also, if you put grafts close in to the trunk, you're helping to make your tree shorter. If you do those close out on the end, not only are they getting the only resources they're getting is that stuff that's hanging out there on the end with them, which might not be enough, but you're making a longer tree. And the idea is do things so they can work back. You can always grow out a longer tree, but try to build them small. And if you need to proportionally grow something out, that's always a lot easier than trying to grow something small. So I would take, when it came time to cut buds on some of my Japanese black pines, or more likely, I would have a donor Japanese black pine and I would reduce a lot of the needles back, and I would do a slice this way, and do a slice that way, causing what's left to be a little wedge-shaped piece of wood. And this is not a good enough lesson to go to listen to me and then just go run off and try to do this. You need to like cue up how to graft Japanese black pine, and you'll see other people doing it. Take a very, 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 very short knife so that you're not crushing the membrane, but you're slicing it as thin as possible, like any gourmet chef you like is watching really close and making that slice. And then you take that same knife and you put your thumb against the back of the blade and you grab the branch and you crease it in there at an angle and just make a little slit. Grab that branch, open up that slit, and then we stick our graft in there. Incidentally, this guy will have been wrapped with paraffin film and will kind of look like a ready rolled cigarette with a see-through paper, because you can kind of still see the green in it, and it'll have that wedge shape. And they'll stick that right in, and then they'll run it, and then they'll close up that branch where they just pulled it open a little, and then with a little bit of the paraffin that they had film that they had wrapped around here, there'll be a tag left off of it hopefully, and then they will use that to go around the base and tie this in, and then that will become, if you've done this a million times, if you're really on your game, you might get 50% of these to take. From that point on, this becomes one of these, like a little bud coming off to the side. We would let that go for a certain amount of time, and then bang, we would cut its competition off, which was the original stock. In the meantime, that little Japanese black pine grafts that take, they're called scions, the ones that take, they will flourish on that tree. At first, they'll play second fiddle to the original stuff, but as we cut back, some of that, as that graft begins to grow, it begins to be empowered. And then as we begin to cut back the ponderosa, not some big huge shift, jump ship from one to the other, you'll wreck it. But you can do a transition. And if we were doing this to a tree that was not in a bonsai pot, well, no, I'm not even gonna say a bonsai pot. I've had it said that it's a better idea to keep some of the original stock on the tree until your next repot. And on your next repot, you're already a couple of years in, your grafted stock is becoming more and more dominant. The original stock has been cut back more and more and more. When it comes time to do that repot, you do that repot, then you can cut back the last of it. Then you're looking at a Japanese black pine. You will have had a couple of years in from the beginning of your grafts to them now becoming, dominant parts of the tree. At that point, you begin to treat your ponderosa as if it is a Japanese black pine. You no longer have to worry about the hardy zones for a ponderosa, which may or may not have been a reason to do this, because not everybody lives at high elevation that wants ponderosa pines. They don't like the coast. I live on the coast. So, but then you can also grow them like Japanese black pines and get that shorter needle. With that little shorter needle lesson like I just repeated earlier, with that we would be able to get a needle length that would be appropriate. That would be quality, bonsai, show, appropriate, not cute and whimsical with a really dynamite looking trunk and tree and base and serious in all other ways. But those cat hair whiskers are kind of whimsical, because those in real life would have to be 20 feet long if you scaled those up. That's about probably all I would be able to do on the Shohin scale with the ponder. Now, the guy behind me, the larger ponderosa, I could have made those needles an acceptable length by doing the method that I described to make ponderosa needles. That as a 2 foot tall ponderosa, I can use that same method, and I could have had the needles down to something that would have, well, maybe this, and that would have been entering the area of what would be acceptable proportion wise. But here's what: that tree is in a pre-bonsai pot. It's in a large container to expand the root size. In order for that system to work, we need restricted roots. We need it in a bonsai pot. So trying to get it to push out 100 tons more buds and trying to let its needles grow really long until it can't make really long needles anymore wouldn't work if it's in a large honking pot and we're sitting there throwing back bio gold to it like they're Skittles, which is what we're doing. So, but also I'm grafting that tree, and I don't want to jinx it, but we've got 6 grafts on that tree. Whenever it comes time this time next year and we really know what we have, we may have some number less than that. We may have none. If we have none, we'll try again. We'll do it again. And if we have 2, 3, 4, that'll be the future of the tree. Even 2, even 1, that'll probably be the future of the tree. In that case, we will be doing that for the next couple of years. On that 3rd year, it'll be repot time. It'll be repot time anyway, because I will have had it in that large container. It was in there a year before I got it. So it'll probably be in the window for repotting season anyway, but as far as its stage and our development and stuff, I'm gearing up to do this crossover, and then whenever it comes time to repot that large tree, it'll get put in a smaller, more appropriate bonsai pot, and at that point, I won't have to worry about doing a single flush needle reduction. We'll just be balls to the wall then, Japanese black pine needle production, and it'll still be a Yamadori collected from Deadwood, South Dakota, ponderosa, and it'll still have those beautiful deadwood features. The bark on both trees is very, very similar. I think you can pretty much, if you're an expert or you know what you're looking at, or it was your tree and you did it yourself, you'll probably always be able, that's not always true. I think you'll be able to see the grafts. Especially if you know where they are. But that's because you just added something to something, and there should be a demarcation zone line in there. I know every corkbark pine I've ever seen that was made grafted. I can always see where the graft was, even 75 years later. So it might be a little different with those also, because as a graft, it wouldn't have gotten put on a part that had bark on it. So the part where you're going to have a line of this bark and that bark, but they're very, very, very similar. You really can't look at one bark and say, if I picked up a piece of bark and handed it to a bonsai person and said, black pine or ponderosa, they would have to go, because these guys smell like butterscotch. So that's that. That's how you deal with the multi-flush pine. Will these, as beautiful little Shohin that I'm proud of, if I take that method, would they ever have needles short enough to be a show-winning Shohin? Probably not, but we could get those guys down. We could get those guys down to about that, and that would make for a pretty cool looking. That would make for a pretty respectable looking tree. Not a show winner, but a pretty respectable tree. We want to get them smaller than that, we would be looking at grafting stock on there that had smaller needles than that, and they sure lend themselves. Ponderosas will lend themselves to the adaptation of quite a few different species if you want to of pine, if you want to go that route. And also, I wish they did better. I would like to grow ponderosis as ponderosis too. I'm not 100% sure that there are several subspecies of ponderosa. The big guy behind me, that's a Yamadori, and my smaller Yamadori are both scopularum. I don't know what species these are. I asked the nursery and they didn't say. I'm surrounded by ponderosas that do well. I've been warned by some of the elders that they would grow well here for 1 or 2 years and then burn out and die. I experienced some ponderosa death with my older Yamadoris. One of them came in on order that had been AWOL for weeks on end. I don't want to say a month, but it was closer to a month than 3 weeks. And it didn't die immediately, which gave me hope at the time, but it died. And it came with another one, and the other one was Hoss. So I had these 2 Shohin. And about the time people were saying, I don't know if you can get away with growing ponderosas there, and I go, the Oakland Botanical Garden has some. My bonsai master up the street has some. Some of the people in the club that I used to belong to say it's fine, and they have some. But there's caveats to that. The guys in the club might have lived in the Oakland Hills. That is different than here. Little subclimates, little mini climates. The guy at the bonsai garden hadn't had his for years. He buys and sells trees. It might have came and went. The other people that have said that they have them, the Oakland Botanical Garden, it might be a different subspecies and not scopularum. So I haven't figured out their success and death rate, or it could be that I'm mistaken and that they can be fine here. I just had bad luck with those 2. The other one, Hoss, I thought it was underpotted when I got it. It did fine. It did fine the whole time. When I got a chance to up-pot that tree, I did, and I did it at the right time. Well, I didn't up-pot it. The first thing I did was decide that it had been in that small pot too long without getting taken out and getting a little trim and having new substrate put in there. I did that, and then within 3 weeks, I landed on what was the perfect pot, and I had the really bad idea to just take the tree back out, not do anything to the root, but overpot it back in that pot, as if it hadn't already been potted 3 weeks ago, and that killed it. Pure and simple. So that's what happened to my first 2 Yamadori pines that came down here, but it was about that time some of the elders that were already going, yeah, no, we're going, I kind of would have expected for you not to get away with anything having ponderosis down there. So you've kind of got an example about what was going on in my head about my luck with ponderosa pines versus what I've been experiencing. So I've had my other 2 for a year and going on a year and a half. My other Shohin ponderosa is a 20-year plus Yamadori. I've got videos where I repotted it a year ago, and it is still in that process where I'm feeding it and I'm watering it, but I also did some cutback on it to bring it into a shape that I like. I did that at the expense of our needle growth. Because remember, I started off by saying we don't want to reduce any of our needle count. We don't want to cut our candles at all this year. We don't want to go back through and do a styling that involves cutting off a lot of branches or anything. We can pull off some of the ratty underneath stuff, but even then, you do that at the expense of your goal of shorter needles. The needles that you remove underneath that are unsightly, where you try to clean up your tree, that's just allocating more energy to the other needles, and they're just going to get longer because of that. And what we're trying to do is come up with so many needles that the tree can't possibly keep them that small. But things are looking good. We're being really productive. Appreciate all the food and water, but I've made so many buds. I hope you know I can't continue to make them a foot long the way we've been doing. And you go, yeah, well, that's a shame. And it just plays right into your evil hands. So that's the long and the short. And the long again on ponderosa pines. I think you can see on some of these guys, it's like this guy, it's got just so many buds coming out. We have this cool exposed root thing happening. And right now this tree is a little bit well behaved in that it doesn't look quite as long and quite as gangly. But at the end of the day, everything is going to run on this tree until it gets quite long and kind of gangly looking. And this top will be out here before we do anything, and that won't be Shohin. But when we get our needle length where we want it, the show is still going to be. I'm trying to show you without actually harming needles. The show is still going to be back here. Everything will get chopped down to that. And in the meantime, all those buds, all that other stuff, it's just going to fatten all that stuff that we did. Like and subscribe. If you guys have not already, we'll probably do another bit tomorrow. I'm starting to compose a material for a show that I intend to do mañana here on the Bonsai balcony. Probably about the same location. And yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. I appreciate you. And Frida, Reba Darcy appreciates you. All of the trees here at this table were ordered in groups of 10 from nurseries around the country, just out of state basically, and for less than $60 or $70 with shipping. I ended up with so many cool bonds. I killed a couple out of both batches, but still ended up with a lot of really neat little trees. And you learn so much from these. I couldn't recommend that enough. I also couldn't recommend you trying your luck with ponderosas, especially for you guys who live in colder climates. They tell me that not only do these guys not quite get cold enough, but they also, because of that short growing season at high elevations, they may not get hot enough either. But one thing I did to my smaller ponderosas, like my other one that is a Shohin, I put it in the freezer. I put it in the freezer for 4 nights this winter. On days that we had where we were in the low 50s during the day, that would mean that we would be at the low 40s at 10 o'clock at night. And at that point, it would have had a day of cooler. And at 10 o'clock, I would take it and put it in the bottom of the ice box next to, on top of the vegetable part. See, it's night, so it's not missing sunlight. I would leave the door cracked so that it wouldn't be in a vacuum. It wouldn't, there would be an exchange of air, but it's still going to be in the lower 40s in the refrigerator. And then 2 hours later, when I would get ready to go to bed at around midnight or midnight-ish, I take it from there to the freezer. And I would take a towel and put down in the bottom of the freezer. I'd move back all the peas and all the every crap that sits in your freezer for years. Move back all that other stuff. Take a towel so that the pot will not turn to a frozen piece of ceramic, and sit the pot on that. And then I took a bag with ice cubes in it from when I kept my surgeries. I always just kept little ice bags. Me and the boxers would do that. I used that as a doorstop and let the freezer's door stay cracked that much. The next morning when my alarm clock hit, I'd pop up, go to the freezer, and take that guy out of the freezer back to the fridge. So then it would go from 35 back to 40, and then when I got out of the shower after running around and before I watered, the guy would go back out in the 40, 50 degree temperatures on the balcony. I did that for enough nights that in theory I accumulated some cold weather, shut it off hard, to tell the tree to shut off so that it doesn't come up they shouldn't make a second flush of needles every year. If they're doing that, that's probably a sign that you're running the tree into the ground. You go, yeah, wow, this thing is just kicking butt and taking names, and then it starts this decline that it won't stop. That was the last little bit of, oh yeah, let me tell you about this thing. I appreciate you, Frida appreciates you, and our next drop will be tomorrow. All stuff I've already said. And thank you so much for watching. Can she do it? Why don't we do this? Yeah. So yeah, I think those guys came out nice.